First, I just want to thank you so much for making the time.
Such an honor to be here. Thank you, Stu.
Amazing. I wanted to first give you a chance just to properly introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you, Stu, for having me. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I guess I have a hard time describing what I do because I do a lot of things, but we want to put it into buckets. I am an early stage startup investor. I've been running strategy for a startup studio for a couple of years. I'm now working on a super exciting project that I'm announcing later this week. But I would say the kind of unifying thread of my work is just thinking about how to bring more creativity and empathy and humanity and delight to tech and business. And yeah, I guess that's pretty apparent if you read my newsletter.
Amazing. I know a lot of folks on the call are familiar with your work, which is all the better. We can get right into it. But I was going to start at the very beginning, which is what prompted you to start Check Your Pulse in the first place?
Yeah, I think when you are doing, I guess maybe back in 2019, I think I was reading way too much Naval and I was just getting tired of renting my time. I was doing so much consulting. And when you do consulting, your ideas are constrained to your clients. I would spend so much time producing work that I was really proud of, but that work was really constrained to the people in the room. And so there was like some itch inside of me that felt like I'm doing really well. People are responding well to my work. I'm not being able to share my ideas with the world. And so I guess, it almost like I didn't start writing long form essays or anything like that. It started as I feel like I have a knack for finding and discovering information. And there's some itch that's telling me that there's something left untold here. And this was back in May 2019 before Substack. I didn't even imagine Substack becoming a venture scale project. But yeah, I think over time, as the quality of my subscribers increased and my confidence increased, I started doing some more of my own writing.
Amazing. And one thing I love that you did after sending out your 52nd issue of your newsletter, you distilled many of the key lessons and insights you had learned, because I think shipping 50 of anything is extraordinarily challenging, as I think most people on the call can attest. And so you put together kind of some lessons, and I wanted to actually share and dive into a few of them because I think a lot of folks here will get a lot of value. But one of the first things you wrote is that interesting things happen when you do interesting things. And you actually wrote this during the pandemic, which is reassuring because it means that life can go on even when the world is closed down. But I'm curious if you could just elaborate a bit on what you meant by that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think probably one of the most interesting things that has come as a result of my newsletter is I remember earlier last year thinking here, like the key people I'd love to connect with. And there was a list of maybe 10 or so people. And I think it was Byrne Hobart that said, writing is networking for introverts. More than half of the people on that list have reached out to me as a result of those ideas that I've shared. So I think in so many ways, there's just so much serendipitous inbound. I think the other piece is, and I think this is underestimated, which is having time to think and reflect is really uncommon in this day and age. I genuinely think anyone that sits down and spends enough time thinking about something is going to come up with a good idea or a good take on something. And having a newsletter forces you to find those moments of reflection. I don't think there's anything special about me. I think if you have great taste, even if your skill level doesn't match your taste initially, I think with good taste and time, everyone's is bound to just create great content.
Yeah, that's something I know everyone has their system to create accountability or to produce something. But it's interesting. I know one thing you've talked a lot about that's on the list is that writing consistently high quality stuff is very challenging. And furthermore, I think you've been maybe on the other side of consistency being the driving value. Shipping something every week is maybe less important than what you ship. But I'm curious to hear you elaborate on how you've set yourself up to be able to reliably produce, great writing.
Yeah, I'll get into my process. I think to me, it's really important that I not just become like a part of this like machine that is like part of this modern news cycle that you just have to constantly churn new content, because I don't think the world needs more content. I think the world needs better content. And so my process is, when I have a spark of something that I feel like I have to say, I'll start a Google Doc, I'll start dumping ideas on there. And then when the mood strikes, I'll start to organize those ideas. and then I sleep on them and I edit them the next day. And so there's just something about sleeping on it and not doing it under pressure that just allows you to, like, just the bar for quality when you look at something for several days even is just so much higher. So I almost feel like sometimes people attribute to genius what is just time.
Totally. The Scott Dickers, who's the editor at The Onion of all places, he wrote this whole book about writing, and that was one of his core ideas. It's like sleep and space are your best friends when it comes to letting ideas kind of marinate. So one thing I was really curious about is you have done this amazing job of aligning your writing and maybe the topics you cover with things you're doing professionally and with maybe things you're investing in, products you want to build, et cetera. So I'm really curious how you've gone about choosing ideas, deciding what is worth spending your time on, and just generally how you decide where to spend your energy writing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when I first started, I there was no theme really. It was just things that are interesting. I knew that I wanted to write content that uplifts. Like to me, it was very important that my newsletter also be a feeling and that you walk away feeling uplifted, inspired. I put out this tweet last week that the greatest underutilized asset is people's time they spend uninspired, and I really believe that. And I wanted my newsletter to be just a source of excitement and made people feel alive and inspired. I think that the kind of leaning into startups came over time. I think the project that I'm working on is very much related to being a builder. It feels, I think, in some ways it's COVID induced. I think that the future is up for grabs, and the world is shifting underneath our feet, and we just need more people to build. And so it felt like celebrating builders, uncovering opportunities for builders, distilling kind of spaces. I've written a lot about the participatory economy, the blurring lines between the creator and consumer. So just to me, like my newsletter is a success if it inspires more people to build.
Yeah, I love this idea. I don't think I've ever heard it actually, of like really leading with a feeling and leading with kind of an experience you want people to have. I am curious, and you just touched on it there, but I'm curious how you went about maybe choosing that as the thing that you want your readers to leave with. Because I think sometimes it's very hard to think about the reader experience almost like a user experience in a product. But I'm curious, why those things
It's
mattered to
funny
you.
now that I think about it. Before writing my newsletter, actually, and I omitted this part of the story, but before I started my newsletter, I was doing weekly roundups on my personal Instagram called What Inspired Me This Week. I just felt like I was seeing a lot of great content, and my friends saw me as this person who was extremely online, and they benefited from the content I shared. And so it just felt like a nice way to end the week on Fridays, just doing these roundups. And I guess I moved away from Instagram because Instagram is an environment that discourages reflection. And I was like particularly interested in helping people think and reflect. And so the newsletter medium felt more appropriate. But I think that the leading with a feeling is something that, like that I had going for me, and that was really the lead into starting the newsletter.
Yeah, I love that. Because I think one of the most common things we hear, like people getting really hung up, and I certainly battle this with what's my niche, what's my signature thing, what's my positioning. And I think all that stuff is very important. But I'm curious how you thought about that early on. Did you have any doubts about how to define what you were going to do, how you were going to be distinct in the sea of Substacks that are out there? Or for you, really, was it more this question of following your curiosity wherever it may lead?
To me, I guess it was always like, is this something I would want to read? Like the bar was like, I have a high bar. I think that respect for my readers' time is my number one priority, because I want my time to be respected. I am drowning in information. I struggle with fear of missing something important. And I'm sure that's something other people struggle with. And so I didn't just want to add to the sea of information and content and link roundups. And that's why, to me, sharing a link isn't interesting. Share the key insight, share like your take on it. To me, success is not getting people to click into the links. It's, did you learn something? Is there something that you can take away from this that you can apply to your life? So I think, I don't know, I have two kids, I have a lot of work. It's a pandemic. Like, it's been really overwhelming. I know everyone's overwhelmed, and I empathize with that feeling. And the last thing I want to do is write a 15-minute essay that could have been a 3-minute essay.
Yes. And this actually brings me to one of your learnings that you shared, which I think was inspired by Josh Constein. But this is what you wrote in the slide deck, which is write. Nobody wants to read your shit. think about the content density of everything you write, how many oohs, ahs, et cetera, per second. So I love that framing. And I'm really am curious how you got check yourself on, is this actually high signal? I love your framing of insight is really the value that I'm delivering, not more content per se. But how do you got check yourself on how you're doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure I like it's just a gut feeling, but to me it's at the end of the day and the other piece there was books don't change lives, sentences do. And so to me it's if I was to take everything I've written today and highlight three sentences that if you weren't reading this today, those three sentences would give you the gist. What would those sentences be? And highlight those sentences, like even just make it skimmable, even from a design perspective, make sure that like you don't have to read the full thing and you're just bolding certain things. Yeah. I don't want people to spend a lot of time engaging with my work. I want them, to me, the right metric is, do you have a unique insight after reading my work that you can apply to what you're doing? And that's not a function of time, which is, I think, part of like why I don't want to be part of this like media machine that relies on time and attention, because that's not the right metric for me.
I know, and I am curious for you, what is the metric or the test of quality in your opinion? And maybe more specifically, I'm curious if you gauge how readers react to what you're writing, maybe how you listen to feedback that you get. But I'm just curious, as you've written consistently the past couple of years, how you just gauge like how you're doing on that metric of, sharing
Yeah,
dense
I
insight.
think a lot of it is just in like instinct and feedback loop. There are certain posts where a lot of people reply and like finish, bring the idea full circle, either point me to interesting resources like that. There's just something about the way people engage that is just something that you feel. Open rates are definitely important. I think that if you, and I think if to me, the metric that I would love for Substack to share, which I don't know, is how many of my readers read 100% of my newsletters. If I knew what that metric was, like that to me would be my North Star, is how many people like know that I honor their time and that everything I am delivering to their inbox is worth reading. And I don't know what that number is, but that to me would be my North Star metric.
I know. I think that's brilliant. Yeah. MailChimp is a very shaky version of that, but it is fun to see who are my super fans, what percentage of my reader base represent consistent openers. And I love that. That's such a great metric of finding your kind of super fans. So one thing I'm really interested in transitioning into is, again, how you've used the newsletter with like your real world projects that you have going on and like some of your actual interests where you might want to go fund a company or start one yourself. So maybe I'll just start with kind of this open-ended question, but I am curious, as your newsletter has grown, how have you started to see the impact show up in your work in the actual projects you have going on professionally?
Yeah, in so many ways. I would say, even starting with my role as an investor, the companies that I invest in see huge value add in me being able to share my work. So like the companies that I invest in, I authentically believe in and I'm also thinking about. So when I think like when I write about the participatory economy, I've been evaluating the space, looking at companies, even just like from a venture perspective, which is highly competitive. Being able to have access to an audience is something that I think founders really respect. And so I would say my access, like practically speaking, my access to different deals is, and there's just something interesting happening, I think, with venture, where a lot of founders, I think in the spirit of the shift towards the creator economy, prefer these kind of solo investors. And like this idea of dismantling the institution is also happening in venture. And I think that as more people start to write and build out an investment practice, and you see this with Lenny and Nikhil, a lot of newsletter writers, like their source of passive income is their investors. And like from the number of deals that I see to the ability to access them, to the ability to diligence them, and sometimes even just to put an idea out into the world, see how people react. Like part of what I think is broken with venture is that diligence happens in a closed room. And that's why you have like the founder of Rent the Runway pitching a wealthy white investor being like, oh, my wife wouldn't use this, but your wife's not our target audience. I think that with a newsletter, you have this dialogue that allows you to validate ideas in ways that I think is interesting as you think about like how to make that process more collaborative. And that's not something I've explored too much, but it's definitely something I feel is a huge opportunity for somebody that wanted to expand their venture career. I would say that a lot of my kind of energy has gone into this project that I'm working on. And to me, this idea that like you are not constrained by not having a network, you are constrained by what you can offer to that network. And I now feel that as in for this particular project that I'm working on, when I reach out to someone for help, I have something to offer. I've written about this subject. I can make, if you are evaluating a space or thinking about something, I have insights to share. And I think the big thing here is I remember I was a founder in 2012, and I remember being connected to all these potential advisors, and it felt like I was begging them to join me. And in so many ways, I feel like what this newsletter has allowed me is I don't have to ask for permission because the people come to me. And like it's again, it's the serendipitous inbound that is really high quality because good writing has a way of finding great people on the internet. It's pretty beautiful to witness.
Yeah, I love that. And Sarah in the chat just put pull, not push, which is perfect way of summarizing. I love the gravitational, just the gravitational pull you can create for yourself.
Yeah, I would say like the one thing I've learned, I think, is nowadays, like if I look back to my 2012 self and I was spending so much time attending conferences and networking events, like the most effective form of networking is to write your thoughts online. It will attract people who are like-minded, who can share ideas, who can become collaborators. It's just like networking 2.0 is writing.
I love that so much. And you're right. So it even goes, it's like an extension of writing online as networking for introverts. It's effective for almost anybody willing to put in the work. And I love that framing. One thing you touched on, it's funny, I wasn't even thinking about diving into this, but you just blew my mind a little bit there with the kind of solo VC thesis there, where you with enough audience, I know Packy McCormick, for example, has launched a syndicate with Not Boring, and I'm sure many are going to follow. But I actually love this idea that your audience can not only bring you deals, but help you vet them. Maybe you can find some LPs. I'm curious if that's been something that you've really, thought about deeply and maybe see as something that writing can do for other careers. I'm just curious if that's
I think that like the overarching theme here is that the boundaries between creator and consumer are blurring. And so your consumers can invest in your deals. They can bring you opportunity. They can help you diligence them. The moment that you shift your thinking from being this authority to being this like matchmaker, I just think that the design space completely changes. I think for all the talk of like venture investing in the future, venture itself is really stagnant as an industry. And so I think that people like Packy are definitely pushing the envelope. I think again, those things take time. I've certainly thought about them. They're not a focus or priority for me, but I've certainly witnessed how it's like the opportunity. And again, I've seen like all of the rolling fund structure, all of these things are converging. There's like innovation as far as like funding instruments. There's innovation in terms of like audience development. There's also just cultural shifts around venture in general. Most companies that raise from multi-billion-dollar funds didn't really know what they were getting into. And now I think it's clearer. And so the idea of raising from angels or smaller micro funds is a lot more appealing to a lot of founders. So I think all of those trends are converging. And that just means that if you are somebody who is building an audience and writing and wants to get into this space, there's just a lot of design space and opportunities to create something unique.
There's the mute button. Yeah, I know, I'm just like, you've definitely got my mind racing on all the different verticals and careers where just having this audience and this momentum could really free you up, whether or not you want to jump on is a different question, free you up to do almost like invent a new category of worker and career. So I think that's a lot of fun to think about.
The biggest challenge for founders, like building things people want. And you typically are like, you're running focus groups or things like that. Those like things are often useless. I think to be able to have a 24/7 dialogue with people who are interested in what you're building. So I just think as from a builder perspective, it's building in public, but I think that having ownership over that email list is a really effective way to do that.
Totally. And that was actually going to segue nicely into another thing that I think is top of mind for a lot of people who have maybe started to get over the friction of publishing more online. Maybe they've got a Substack, they've shipped a few issues, they're starting to use Twitter more. I'm really curious, what have been your biggest moments for growth and for continuing to expand your audience and your readership? I'm curious if that's something you've engineered heavily and focused a lot on, or if it's evolved more organically. Curious to hear a bit about how you
100% organically. I would say I've done a really shitty job of marketing my newsletter. I post to Twitter and I just write stuff, but I haven't spent $1 on paid marketing, which either way, it doesn't feel like the right way to grow my newsletter for my objectives. I wish I had something super revealing to say here. Like there's so many newsletter guides and they charge $1,000, and like the reality is you just need to produce really good content that's worth sharing. And that's hard to do, but that's like the newsletter guides tell you how to do the easy things, not the hard thing, which is write something that you would want to read yourself. And I don't think there's like much of a formula beyond that.
I love that. I know it's like the hard truth that we all must face.
I don't know. I'm sure I could do like growth hacking, and there's a bunch of stuff I could do to have more subscribers for sure. But again, I don't know that would translate into engagement. Like in order to actually build something sustainable, you just have to make something good.
100%. And so one other thing that I just was really curious to get your opinion on is that I think a lot of folks have been seeing the rise of a lot of kind of successful paid Substacks, thinking about a lot of expertise they may have that actually is like directly monetizable. But I know you've gone in a different direction and actually you really have no intention or maybe even interest in going the paid route with your newsletter. And I'm just super curious to hear more about, your thinking behind that and how you would encourage other people to think about whether to stay free or try to build something paid.
Yeah, I think like the most exciting part about my newsletter is that my ideas have spread and it's led to more ideas. And to me, as a number one, constraining who can get access to those ideas is wrong for my particular purpose. I think secondly, like content is a commodity. And I think that, yes, a lot of Substack writers are doing well. And I think that they will continue to, like some writers will continue to see success. I don't think that the paid newsletter is the right format to capture value for most people. And I think that's true for a few reasons. Like one is it's really hard to create good content. It's, to do that consistently is just a skill that not everyone has. I think everyone can come up with great insights. Everyone can write a great essay. Everyone is an essay away from great opportunities, but can everyone produce weekly content that's really good? And I think for me, like I still struggle to read the free editions of a lot of newsletters. So it's hard for me to, even for creators whose work I really like, it's hard for me to, and I support a lot of them, but it's hard for me to justify because there's a time constraint. Like I don't have time to read the free version and the paid version. And again, I read a lot, I'm subscribed to a lot of newsletters. I'm not bearish on paid newsletters. I think the key thing I'd want to communicate is that more people should write great essays than should start like newsletters that have a consistent cadence, because the former is going to unlock a lot of opportunities. The latter commits you to writing on a fixed schedule, which is something that I think a lot of people don't want to do. It also productizes your time. Like the reality is that I can write an incredible essay and press send. And if I had a paid newsletter, I still have to write something the following week. It's just this never ending machine that doesn't, I'm a startup investor, so I definitely have the like software, like scale piece. Like I can't think of, I can't, that doesn't scale my hours. I still have to, there's this tension between like subscription and membership. And I think subscription, like people want to see more content. And I don't want to create more content. I don't want to force myself to do it. I want to write when I have something to say, not when people are expecting me to have something to say. But membership is really interesting because that's when you say, all right, we've created this worldview here. We have a unique way to look at the world, and kind of the newsletter is it's just the worldview, what brings people together, but people are not paying for the content. they're paying for the serendipity that might result from connecting a lot of people that are reading the same thing, because presumably there's a lot of overlap in interests across readers. So I think that's an interesting angle. I think that you could do that. When I posted the lessons, some people said, oh, but you can have a paid newsletter without a consistent cadence. You can. I think it's not the norm or the expectation. I certainly think some people can do that. And I love this idea, the Robin Sloan idea of having seasons. Like, what does it mean to have a season for your newsletter? And for a couple of weeks, I'm thinking about one thing and sharing that. So I certainly think that those formats are interesting. And if you could have a 1 to 2 month season, it's easier to commit to a weekly post for 2 months. And that's potentially an interesting paid opportunity. But yeah, so that was just a long ramble. The last thing I'd say is, I don't know, there's something about knowledge wants to be free. The people that should be reading my work are not necessarily the VCs. They could be the aspiring builder, the students. To me, the beauty of the internet is zero marginal cost. And this idea of limiting artificially limiting reach, especially for the kind of content that I write, that I want to reach students and future builders, it feels wrong.
Oh my God, it's just a gold mine of wisdom. First of all, Tom in the chat was asking, when are we going to see Check Your Pulse merch? Because we are ready. I want a sweatshirt. Yeah. And Tom and I were talking earlier this week about how your batting average on your newsletter is just unfair. The number of good stuff you produce is amazing. Yes, Sterling had also in the group talked about the idea of these kind of serialized series of emails where maybe you do have a cap on the time horizon or the number of essays. So that's also a really interesting idea, but love the framing. I think that's extremely clarifying.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, just to a sneak peek of part of the, I think, so many newsletter writers have a gold mine in their archives, but how often do you go back to look at an archive? You rarely do. And I think that Substack just makes that worse, because the expectation is you're not notified. There's no, remember this thing I said. Sometimes I surprise myself with things I've written in the past. I was like, oh, that's really good. So I think that there's some, the reason I'm so interested in new architectures that almost expand the shelf life of content is because it almost feels unfair for writers who've produced really great stuff to expect them to constantly produce more stuff when their archive itself is a goldmine.
Yeah, I love that. Sherry Hugh, who we interviewed as she writes about the music industry, talked about record labels make all their money from the back catalog, not really from the new songs. And is there a way for writers to do the same? Love the framing, because you have all this great value that gets locked up if you're pressured to keep shipping. So I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions. Then I do want anyone on the call with questions or topics they want to dive into to just start thinking about anything you might want to ask Sari about, and we'll go into a Q&A here in a couple of minutes. But yeah, one just final thing I was really curious to get your input on is, I love that, rerun seasons for newsletters. Totally. One thing I'm really curious to get your input on, you touched on it earlier, but is maybe how reader feedback, the responses you've gotten on certain pieces have helped shape the direction of where you've taken Check Your Pulse, if at all. But I am curious how just that constant kind of relationship and feedback loop between your readers has shaped what you do now.
I say that the first, I would say 8 months of writing the newsletter, my newsletter was mostly a curation of interesting links with maybe a paragraph intro with just a thought of something I was thinking of that I wouldn't that would just take me 15 minutes or under an hour to write. I think that I realized over time, I initially, I think, saw myself more as a curator of existing information, and over time have shifted to creating more of my own content, because that's really what's resonated. So I would say the newsletter has certainly, based on the response, shifted towards just creating content. And I don't know, I'm bad at explaining what is special about it, to be honest.
Totally. I know it is part this intangible subjective thing. So I know it's never cut and dry. Well, what I want to do now, I want to invite anybody who just wants to dive into a few of the topics. We tried to cast a wide net there of just a few things we could dive into. I think we have a manageable enough number of folks. We'll see if it descends into chaos. But if you have a question, you're welcome to just unmute and take the floor. And I will be our moderator here, but anybody's welcome to lob the first one out. You feel free to just unmute. And yeah, Josh, go for it.
Hey, I noticed on your website, and this may be the project that you referenced earlier, you said we live in an information age, but good information has never been harder to find. Something new is coming. And then you also mentioned like new forms of information architecture. And I was super curious if you could expand on that, because I also have a bazillion ideas for how that could be implemented as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think that is, by the way, the project that I'm working on. I think the like people complain a lot about social media and the fact that it's made us narcissists. But I think that the real sin of social media is that it's made us stuck in the present because the architecture of those platforms has a now orientation. You like try to find something that you remember someone posting on Twitter a few months ago, and the platform is just not designed for that. So I think that this obsession with the present has created environments that discourage reflection because on Twitter, you're not spending, like when you read a hot take on Twitter and you see a number next to it that says 5,000 likes and it seems like a hot take, you're not actually reflecting on it. Do I believe in this? What is like the counterpoint to this? Is this something I agree with? It's just a hot take and you're just clicking and moving on. It's an environment that strips context. It's an environment that's designed from a business model perspective to distract, not to learn. And so to me, like I crave spaces where the goal is like to improve your future self, to learn. And frankly, that's just like we just need a new paradigm as far as our information environment. So I think that there's a lot of design space to explore there. I would say I've been thinking about this a lot for the past year. I probably have more questions than answers. And my approach is going to be like, hey, here's my thesis around how this could work for a particular vertical. Let's like band together to figure this out. And because I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm around this, but it's also very, very new. Would a business model? Yeah, certainly not ad-based, but I think that's part of what's exciting is that it's more like new business models are more feasible now. Like the feasibility of paid communities and just commerce and membership and events and micro tipping. Actually, Andreessen Horowitz put out an interesting article on different business models for consumer social earlier this week. So part of the why now for something like this is I think it's far more feasible to build communities that are not ad-based.
I'm curious, how do you get signal from an older piece on the web right now? Because sometimes I'll like stumble on someone's curated list of content and it looks great. I want to dig into it all, but it's just it's almost overwhelming the amount of stuff that's there. And so it's almost like prioritizing content in like a progressive way. And I wonder if you have a good way to do that, which kind of ties into both curation for newsletter, but also what you're talking about.
No, it's certainly broken. I think that what you're feeling, I think a lot of people feel. And I think that the fact that there's a lot of information and the fact that feels overwhelming, I don't think that's inevitable. I think that's a result of how we've designed these environments. I do think that this abundance can be freeing. It can lead to more creativity. If you had the peace of mind that you stumbled upon this creator and their archive would be easily findable in the future, or you could distill their key insights quickly, or because the reality is, this is something I've written about in the past, but like right now, it's back to the push versus pull. We read content because it's in front of us. If you are like thinking about communities or thinking about, I don't know, the future of food or the future of social networks, that's when those pieces are relevant. That's when you want to access them. And yeah, this is like the problem that I'm obsessed with and would love, by the way, the feedback reactions to the project I'm working on, which admittedly is still very much day one. It's bootstrapped and self-funded by design. It's definitely like a first stab at all of these things.
Thanks.
Amazing. Anyone's welcome to unmute and go next.
Hey, sorry. Quick, my name is Avni. Actually, I reached out, I could Twitter DM because I just love the stuff that curious, you mentioned a little bit about your process. I'm really interested in that part of it. It's a little bit more in like the weeds, but again, 2 kids, I'm a founder. I'm always curious about how people have the discipline and are very creative. And I know you show up and there's morning pages and there's things like that, but I'm especially particularly interested in, because a lot of what you said around like writing essays when you have an idea and then you start to create something around that really resonates. But the part around the 2 kids and the other job and like all that kind of stuff, I'm really just curious how you think about that.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. I think my process is when I have an idea for something I want to write, again, I'll open a Google Doc and start to dump things. When I feel like, all right, this is like daunting, but I need to organize, that's when I will carve out time in my thinking time in my calendar. And I'm like militant about that. So I will go in my calendar when I feel like it's ready. There's like this gut feeling that I'm like, all right, there's enough stuff there. I want to spend 3 hours just thinking about this. That's when I'll just look at my calendar for the week and say, all right, I guess the key really is like longer periods of time, because you can't write if you're context shifting. So it has to be like on a day where like my schedule with my kids is conducive to that. And it has to be on a day where I don't have back-to-back meetings. It reminds me of Paul Graham's maker versus manager schedule. There are some days where
totally.
It's impossible to assume that I can spend time writing because I am just like in back-to-back meetings and my headspace isn't there. So I think that when it feels right, and I don't know, there's no formula to that, I do put in my calendar like big thinking.
And it sounds like you're probably like developing multiple different interesting threads and ideas at the same time, just with like different docs.
Yeah, I have 4 or 5 docs at any given point in time where I'm just dumping things, and it's very much like when the mood strikes.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
God, I love that. That's refreshing. I always get a little freaked out when people are extremely systematic with something that I think is a bit more of a mysterious process. So I love that answer. And
I think
John,
some people, it works for some people. I don't know. Like I really need this work. Like my life is stressful as it is. I don't need my writing to be stressful. I need it to be a source of like creativity and fulfillment. It really comes down to that.
Sad. Josh, please.
You mentioned that you just, whenever you have ideas, you throw them in Google Docs. And I've thought a lot about that specific concept myself, because at first I would just say, oh, I want to write, but I need to think about what I'm doing first before I start writing. And then I realized that the key was, no, you just need to get down, hammer it out, and then whatever happens, like just remove all the friction between you starting and writing and stuff. And so I did that. But then the next problem became, okay, I have 57 different drafts of varying sizes and shapes, like all just spewing over my desktop. And then I thought, okay, there maybe needs to be some kind of process here. And that's where I'm at right now. I would love to say I figured that out, but it's just, there's this eternal struggle between removing the friction, but also it seems like it's friction debt or like organization debt. Like I wish that the things that I wrote, I could put them into this self-organizing system and it would just organize itself.
Yeah, it's funny. Like that frustration, I feel that like every time I look at my Google dump, I'm not necessarily excited. I'm daunted by it. It feels hard, but I think that's what good writing is supposed to feel like. I think it's like the kind of thing where you just like stare at a screen and you're just like, sometimes I just want excuses to not have to do this because it's hard. But I can't imagine something that is so much about making interesting connections. Like I think it's a messy process, and it should be, because the mind is messy.
Beautifully said. Amazing. Anyone is welcome to take the floor next. And I've got a couple other backup questions, but if there's anyone on the call who wants to unmute, yeah, Mike, feel free.
Yeah, I guess just talking about the architecture of ideas or how they bounce around. I think back to Derek Sivers, some of his techniques where in some ways, he doesn't care where the reference is. He has all these ideas, throws them together, parses them out, breaks them down. They're just the absolute minimal element, throws it in a database, and then moves on. And then when he wants to think about that topic again, a hashtag, random thought, and then all that thought's about. I'm just curious, does that resonate with you? Like it doesn't matter where it came from. And in some ways, a lot of the ideas that on the internet, just massive amount of information, but you could argue some of them have been around for millennia. So just curious, like the reference, the sourcing, is that as important?
Yeah, it's so
as
interesting
the
that you
idea
say
itself?
that. I love that you bring this up because there's one key insight that I don't think I've said before is that promoting other people's work is the most effective form of promoting your own newsletter. When you cite people's work, it has a way, like there, I don't think I've written a single newsletter where I cite someone's work where that person doesn't end up getting a hold of the issue somehow and reaching out. And so I think that if growth is important to you and if just like the amount of people exposed to your ideas is important, there's like the referencing is important in the sense that it's the easiest way to connect with those people in a sense. But I fully agree with Derek conceptually. I just like that, like practically the sourcing has been really effective for me, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a way to compliment people. Like I thought your idea was so important that I'm going to write about it, but also acknowledging the benefit that it brought to you. Even if you disagree, if it's like it was interesting enough to talk about. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Anybody else? You're welcome to take the floor. Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. Sorry about coming late, but on your newsletter, when you're talking about the intersection of online communities with knowledge management, content curation. So I've been around from the beginning of the internet, so I've seen a lot of communities, but the amazing imbalance that happens is the small group versus the large group, and that we really find community in the small group and the connections. And I think some of the people who are in the broadcast mostly mode, the content curators, they confuse how much connection they're getting with the fact that there's a bigger community than there really is, because there's not cross connections, there's not small subgroups and things like that. So clearly you've been giving a lot of thought about how online community intersects. You've given a lot of thought about the matchmaking element. What are your thoughts about the small group versus the larger group within communities and how that dynamic might be vital to what you're looking at for this next generation of tech?
Yeah, I love this question because community is now the buzzword and investors are looking to invest in communities. And when I survey my own personal experience, the best communities that I'm part of are certainly not venture-backed companies. I'm part of this like consumer internet curators group on Telegram. It's 5 of us. It's wonderful. I'm part of this Telegram for writers called Type House, and it's 40 of us. It's wonderful. I start to think about, I'm part of this community called Hey Mama for working mothers. They've scaled. There's now thousands of people. My email is flooded with forum questions that reinvent the wheel time after time. Does anyone have a great copywriter to recommend? I just don't need that interruption in the middle of the day. What's interesting about like if we define community as just like in the way that I think it's been poorly defined today as like a group of people that you just plug into a Slack channel or Discord or whatever, then that has diseconomies of scale. It becomes worse as more people join. And like that, in that format, I think that's inevitable. And that's why I think that like the intersection of community and knowledge management is interesting, because to like the example of Hey Mama that I gave, who's a great copywriter? Do you really need to ask that in a channel that's going to notify everyone by email? Like that's just going to dilute the user experience. So I don't necessarily have answers here. I love this question. I love thinking about it. It is funny that the most fulfilling, exciting communities that I belong to are small, and it's like Dunbar's law. But I do think that there are interesting models. I think this idea of like cohorts versus communities is interesting. I think that within a community, there could be sub-communities and smaller groups. I'd love to see more innovation here, because I think that like the magic happens in small groups, and that is not something technology can change.
Yeah, great answer. It's interesting you cite your own examples of a 5-person group, a 40-person group, and then you see the dilution that happens with the larger group. And I think solving for that, yeah, whether it's cohort based, but it really comes down to the relationships that sustain your returning back to this subgroup that's within this larger context. But no, that's great answers. Clearly you're thinking
Yeah,
about
but if you have any, this is something I have more questions on than answers, frankly, but it's something I think a lot about.
Yeah, I'll share offline with you. I've been working on these questions a lot too, and I have probably more questions than answers, but it's cool stuff. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Amazing question. I think we've got time for maybe one more. If anybody wants to take the last slot, you're welcome to unmute and do.
Yeah, I was this maybe just more of a comment, but just riffing on that as you think about the 1,000 True Fans model. And like, for what I do, I write a newsletter that's more personal, and I don't really have, I write for my career, but it's also more just like it started as like an act of service. So as I've thought about more about that, I'm like, where am I really going with this? And you see a lot of creators just go the route of suddenly you release a course on how to be a creator. And it just becomes this like weird snake creature where I was a creator and then I recruited other creators, and it almost feels like some kind of weird Ponzi scheme, but you do wonder where it's going. And I think that comment, Roger, is so insightful, because I just have noticed over and over again in all the communities I've been involved in that the minute they get beyond a certain threshold, I'm just out, like for whatever reason, like, and even joining ones that are big, like Nest Labs is one that I belong to, and I keep meaning to cancel it because I'm just like, I can't even get a foothold in here. And I know that a lot of that information is valuable, but it's just really fascinating to see where it goes. From where I'm sitting, it's coming back to how do you monetize individuals, which is where I'm starting to offer coaching services. So we'll see how that goes. But you do think if part of the draw is you're offering people a window into your sensibility and you're not wanting to go the subscription route, like what does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting because the economics around courses are actually way better than the economics around paid newsletters. People can justify $350 for a course, and just 100 people subscribing is the equivalent of like many more having to subscribe to a $10 a month newsletter, which is, I just think that in a world where content is so abundant, what's scarce, it's to me, it's almost like antithetical to this day and age that we are monetizing the content directly as opposed to what's lacking, which is community, belonging, the relational value of content, the unique architecture. And that's why like this idea of databases and knowledge storage is really interesting, because I don't know that people want to pay for more content, but there's a lot of other things surrounding that I think the willingness to pay for is really strong. I'm certainly rooting for Substack and a lot of the creators on there, and I think a lot of them will do really well. But I genuinely think that for the vast majority of creators, there are far better ways to monetize than a monthly paid subscription.
Amen. Said, yeah, that needs to be plastered everywhere. We need to change the narrative. And I know that there's actually some cool companies, Goggin from Udemy is starting the kind of cohort-based platform. And I think it'll be really cool to see probably a lot of Substack writers start to see what are some of the things I could teach. And the economics, I agree, are probably way better there very often.
And again, like back to the point of archives, like you can sell a course continuously. You can sell people don't sell the newsletter archive as much, or it's not something that is ingrained in the value proposition as it is delivered today. Whereas a course, like it's very much like in Jack Butcher's language, like buy one, sell, create once, sell twice, or whatever the phrase is. Whereas I think a newsletter it's really hard to do that. You're just constantly having to churn more content.
100%. I know we're coming up right on time. Sorry, I know you have some exciting news that is not quite ready today, but is coming later this week. Maybe beyond the newsletter, where should folks find you? How should folks follow along? What's the best place to follow you?
First of all, thank you, all of you, for being here today and for reading my newsletter. It really does mean a lot to me. You can find me on my newsletter. You can find me. My email is sari@hey.com and on Twitter. And I always reply. Amazing. The chat is blowing up with thank yous. And I do want to thank you again for making the time. Sorry, this was just unbelievably insightful. Everyone. I see some familiar faces. Josh, Tom, Sterling. Thank you guys so much. Yes. Totally. We'll send out the recording in the next day or two. And thank you all for making the time, and see you back on Twitter /Substack/Slack. All right. See everybody. Take care, everyone. Later. Bye.